this letter to a group of nuns, and in the midst of the letter, he wrote the words, "with love for mankind and hatred of sins." And it has morphed over the years into what we now have it. But back when Augustine wrote it, what he was calling for was for those he was writing to recognize in themselves a love for others and a disapproval, a hating of their own sins that we do to others. As a matter of fact, Gandhi, who wasn't a Christian, but he did have respect for Jesus. Gandhi, in his 1929 autobiography, was quoted as saying, "Hate the sin and not the sinner is a precept which, though easily understandable, is rarely practiced."
But sometimes there are things that
And
just...
that is why the poison of hatred spreads everywhere. Let me say that again. Hate the sin and not the sinner is a precept which, though easy to understand, is rarely practiced. And that is why there is so much poison that is spilled around the world. See, here's what Gandhi and others have realized over the years about this little phrase. Because while it is meant to be loving and kind, and more often than not what it does is it makes those who say it come off as being a little judgmental and more than a little self-righteous. And here's what I mean by that. Found inside that little phrase, and sometimes it is so hidden we don't even know it's there. We don't know it. But found inside the depths of that little phrase is the little preposition, but, which makes it conditional. We love you. But. We love you. But we still see you as a sinner. We love you, but we're still going to keep our eye on you and watch you so that we can call out all the things that we don't like and we hate about you. Hidden inside that little phrase is really a rather convenient and safe way of passing judgment on somebody else. And I think there's a reason why Jesus never said, "Love the sinner." It's because he knew all too well our tendency to judge others and to focus on all that we see wrong with them rather than just seeing them sinners, but as neighbor, as person. Allison was here last week and she did a fantastic job of reminding all of us about being the neighbor. And while Jesus never said the words, "Love the sinner," what he did say was, "Love your neighbor." Because when we begin to see people as neighbor, when we see them as persons and not just the sin or the behavior, it moves us a lot further towards relationship. Jesus talked a lot about loving others. He never made it easy. Love your neighbors. Love your enemies. Because Jesus knew that when we start to see people as people and not just some label like sinner, we can actually begin moving towards real relationship. That beautiful story in the Gospel of John, it didn't start out beautiful. It started out with a bunch of so-called religious godly people bringing out a woman who they had caught in the act of adultery, and we don't know where the other half of the act was. He's not mentioned, he's not there, he's not important, but they have her, and so they want to make an example out of her, and so they bring her to Jesus, and they throw her down in front of him, and they say, "We caught her. This woman, this sinner. Now, according to the law, what should we do with her?" And they wait for him to respond. And while they're all waiting for him to respond, they start picking up the stones because they know what the law says, and they are ready to throw the first stone at this sinner. We don't even know her name. We just know what she's been accused of and what she's done. And then Jesus, gets down on the ground at eye level with her. Not them, with her. He's not looking at them. He's looking at her. And he's scripting in the sand and he's writing. It's the only place in the Gospels where we're told Jesus ever wrote anything. I don't know what he said. I don't know what he wrote. But I do know what he said next. He said to all of those who were standing around, "Okay, those of you without any sin, go ahead and throw out the first stone." And no one wanted to go first. They just stood there looking at each other, waiting for somebody to throw out the first pitch. And no one did. And so they went home. And they left her alone with Jesus. And do you know what Jesus said? He looked at her and he said, "Has no one condemned you? And neither do I. So go and sin no more." You know what happened in that story, don't you? Jesus looked at her as a real person, not just a sin that needed to be hated or a sin that needed to be put to death, but as a person. Sometimes we do it. We can say that we love in the name of Jesus. But really, we can't get past judging the other. In our text this morning from Matthew that I read, Jesus is coming to the tail end of his Sermon on the Mount. And he's been talking for some time about relationships. As a matter of fact, the whole Sermon on the Mount is really all about relationships. Relationships with others, relationships with God. And then here at the tail end of it, as he's rounding third and heading for home with it, he comes back to relationships with others. And he starts talking about judgment and judging others. Now I want to unpack it a little bit here because it's important to understand what Jesus is really saying. The text says, "Do not judge, lest you be judged." And on the surface, it sounds as if Jesus is calling for us never to make any kind of judgments, anybody, period. But that's not exactly what he's saying. Because Jesus, if you look at the life of his ministry, made judgments against people all the time. And it was usually the religious people who thought they were better than everybody else. He turned over the tables in the temple because he had judged them to be corrupting the intent of what it meant to go to worship. He judged the behavior of the Pharisees because he judged that they, in an effort to keep the law and to keep it holy, had forgotten the intent of what it was to begin with. Jesus made judgments all the time, especially about things that can cause injustice or come off as unloving towards others. And we should call out injustice. And we should call out when someone is being unloving towards another. We can't and we shouldn't go without making some judgments in our lives. So then what is Jesus talking about here? What he's saying and what the Greek verb that's used here means is condemn. Do not condemn someone else. If you want to go any deeper, do not condemn to hell, lest you want yourself to be condemned as well. This whole section is all about our tendency to want to condemn others. And Jesus says, no. It's not your place to condemn. It's your place to love. But what happens sometimes with this little phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin, what happens is quite often the love the sinner part gets overshadowed by hate the sin. And in hating the sin, we begin to hate the person. And in hating the person, if we aren't careful, we start condemning them. but it's cloaked in love. But then it's not really love, is it? It's condemnation. In his Sermon on the Mount, he says, do not condemn. Because what that does in those situations where we fail to see someone else as neighbor or as person and just some sinner, what it does is it says to the other that we have written them off as someone who is beyond redemption. We have written them off as someone who is outside God's grace or outside God's mercy. But here's the thing. Followers of Jesus have no right to declare someone who's beyond God's mercy and grace. Because if they are, then we are too. And we know that that is just not true. When love the sinner, hate the sin become. We put ourselves in a position, if we're not careful, of condemning others as sinners rather than loving them as neighbors as Jesus would have us do. But imagine, if you will, what a church would look like if it just genuinely loved others. What would it look like for the church to say, we're not here to judge, we're just here to embrace you as another one of God's sheep? What would it look like if the church stopped judging others and simply came to church to sit and to listen and to deal with our own behavior? A church that isn't self-righteous, but self-reflective. A church that isn't trying to change everybody else. A church that needs to change here. Inside ourselves. Dr. Gerald Jampolsky wrote a book some years ago now. It's in its third edition, so it's been out a while. But he wrote a book called Love is Letting Go of Fear. And in that book, he poses a question. He asks a question. Have you ever given yourself the opportunity of going through just one day concentrating on loving others and making no judgments? And he offers those who read the book kind of a dare. I dare you to do that. And he goes on to say, everything we say or think reacts on us like a boomerang. When we send out judgments in the form of criticism and hatred and anger, guess what comes back at us? Criticism and hatred and anger. When we send out love, guess what comes back? I think Gandhi is right.